Hello, today we're going to be talking about culture. I really love culture. Culture really gets to the heart of what it means to be a human being. So we have this compelling experience of being an individual, of having, a modicum of control over our own thoughts and our own feelings and our own decisions and behaviors. And we often underestimate the extent to which who we are as a person is influenced by the culture of the society that we were brought up in, of the groups that we spent a lot of time with growing up, our families, our schools. And when we think about who we are as a person, that actually a lot of the things that we think, a lot of our preferences, a lot of the ways that we interact with other people and decisions about relationships are driven not just by who you are as a person, but largely by the culture that you live in. And if we look at this picture, we can think of culture as the little blue lines that connect everyone together. And we often underestimate the extent to which those little blue lines influence who we are and what we do. So like, for example, as you're listening to this, you're probably having thoughts about it, and you're having those thoughts in the language that you grew up with, your native language, right? And that even something is so personal and so intimate to us as our inner narrative, our thoughts could not exist without the gift of language that was given to us by our culture. Another way of thinking about culture is that it is the water that we swim in. There's this old joke that was popularized by David Foster Wallace. He didn't come up with it, but he popularized it. And the joke is that there's these two young fish hanging out in the ocean, and they're trying to be all tough looking, smoking their cigs. And this old fish swims by real slow with his hair all gray, and he says, "Hey boys, how's the water today?" And a few minutes after he leaves, one of the young fish turns to the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" Pause for laughter there. Okay, that's the punchline of the joke. And the joke is that when something is so ubiquitous, when we are surrounded by something every single day, we quit seeing it. In the same way that we don't see the oxygen around us, in the same way that we don't think about or perceive, that a fish doesn't think about or perceive the water around it. It's just a part of the world. And that's what culture is. It is the water that we swim in our society. Culture is such an ingrained part of our daily lives that we often don't stop to question it, even when it is really, really weird. So I lived in China for a year, and I'll spare you the details, but the topic of circumcision came up with one of my Chinese friends, and I was explaining circumcision to her. And I was just like, "Oh, this is what we do. It's totally normal." And she had never heard of circumcision before. And as I'm explaining it to her, I see her face drop, and I can just see the horror in her eyes. And I start listening to myself and what I'm saying, and I'm like, "Oh my God, like I sound like a crazy person." And when I finished explaining, there was just like silence, and then she was like, "You do this to little babies?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she's like, "That is very bad. I don't think you should do that." And I was like, "Huh." And regardless of how you feel about circumcision, the fact that I had gotten to be in my early 20s and it never even occurred to me to question that as a cultural practice, and how weird that seems to people who are unfamiliar with that cultural practice. That is what culture is. This just, we take these cultural beliefs and practices for granted to such an extent that we don't even really question them. Culture is a shared story about the world around us. We talked earlier in the semester about neoliberalism, and neoliberalism is a story, right? It's a story that says if it doesn't matter if you're born rich or poor, if you work hard, you're going to be rewarded for it. It's a story that tells us that hard work per se is good and valuable. It's a story that tells us that people who are poor are lazy and that they've brought that on themselves. Those are all part of the stories that are associated with neoliberalism. Okay, so that's kind of a broad level view of what culture is. Next, we're going to dive into more of a very detailed, concrete, scientific definition of culture. And there's going to be 7 aspects to culture. Culture is a set of assumptions created by a group to deal with problems of external adaptation and internal integration that work well enough to be considered valid and is therefore taught to new members as the correct way to perceive those problems. Now, I know this is a long definition, and I really don't want you to memorize it. If you understand what culture is and what function it serves, you don't need to memorize this. You can come up with it each time if you deeply understand what culture is.